For a long time, focusing on yourself was seen as selfish, as if taking care of your own life meant abandoning others, disappointing expectations, or becoming cold. Many women grew up believing that love means giving until there's nothing left, even when that costs their own peace. And little by little, they lose themselves, trying to carry relationships, dreams, and responsibilities that were never meant to be carried alone. But there comes a moment when something shifts inside. A different kind of exhaustion appears. It's not physical, it's emotional. It's your soul asking for silence, space, priority. Focusing on yourself isn't giving up on the world. It's coming home. It's the most intimate and courageous act of self-love, choosing your own energy, respecting your own pace, and stopping the habit of abandoning yourself to fit into other people's lives. When you start focusing on yourself, everything changes. Not because you become distant, but because you become whole. If this topic has ever resonated with you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and stick with me. What's coming next might change the way you treat yourself every day. First topic. Focusing on yourself begins when you stop abandoning yourself. For a long time, I thought putting myself second was maturity. That being strong meant keeping everything to myself. That loving meant always being available, even when it cost me sleepless nights, constant anxiety, and a quiet sense of emptiness. I used to say I was fine, but my body and my mind knew I wasn't. The problem is, we get used to abandoning ourselves little by little, almost without noticing. First, you ignore a boundary, then a desire, next an entire dream. Focusing on yourself starts right there, when you realize no one's going to give back what you left behind. It's not a dramatic decision, it's a deeply personal one. It's looking at your own life and admitting you lost yourself trying to be everything for everyone. And that hurts, because it comes with guilt. Guilt for choosing yourself. Guilt for saying no. Guilt for no longer being able to sustain old versions of who you were. I remember the day I realized this. I was tired, irritated, out of patience with the world. I thought people were the problem, but they weren't. The problem was me. I had stopped listening to myself a long time ago. That's when I understood. Focusing on me wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. It was emotional survival. When you stop abandoning yourself, something changes quietly. You begin to truly notice what you feel, what you want, what you need. And this shift doesn't pull you away from the world. It brings you closer to yourself. Comment, I choose to stop abandoning myself. That phrase marks the beginning of the return to yourself. Second topic. Focusing on yourself takes courage to disappoint expectations. One of the biggest reasons so many women struggle to focus on themselves is fear of disappointing others, fear of seeming selfish, fear of hearing that they've changed, fear of no longer being needed. From a young age, many were taught that their worth lies in how much they do for others, how much they give in, how much they adapt. And when they decide to look inward, guilt shows up like an internal alarm. I went through this when I started prioritizing my own life. The reactions weren't instant, but they came. Awkward silences, passive-aggressive comments, people saying I was different. At first it hurt, because part of me wanted to go back, explain myself, justify everything. But another part, a quieter one, started to understand something important. Not every expectation is worth holding up. Focusing on yourself doesn't mean hurting others, but it does mean disappointing those who benefited from your lack of boundaries. And that's uncomfortable. Growth means walking through that discomfort without backing down. Because when you live trying to meet everyone's expectations, you end up living a life that isn't yours. Over time, I realized that disappointing some people was the price I had to pay to stop disappointing myself every day. And that trade-off, while painful at first, was freeing. The peace that follows is worth any initial discomfort. Focusing on yourself means choosing honesty over approval. It means saying, this no longer serves me, even if your voice shakes. It means standing your ground, even in silence. Comment, I don't need to please others to be worthy. This statement reminds you that your value isn't defined by anyone else's expectations. Third topic. The silence that comes from focusing on yourself unsettles those who only knew you as always available. When you start focusing on yourself, something curious happens. You become quieter. Not because you've lost your voice, but because you've stopped explaining yourself. And that silence makes people uncomfortable. Those who are used to your unlimited availability start to notice your absence. Not because you've pulled away, but because you're no longer constantly accessible. I noticed this when I started replying less, justifying less, and choosing more carefully where I put my energy. There were no big announcements, no confrontations, just an inner shift reflected in simple actions. Even so, the impact was huge. Some people saw it as coldness. others as distance. But none of that was true. What had changed wasn't my affection. It was my boundaries. Focusing on yourself is a quiet act, because it doesn't require outside validation. It happens internally. And that's exactly why it unsettles those who only felt secure when you were always available, always accommodating, always fixing things. When you stop overgiving, you reveal something powerful. You have your own life, your own priorities, and a center that no longer revolves around others. That silence feels uncomfortable at first, because you want to explain, to ease the tension, to go back to your old ways. But if you hold your ground, something shifts. Those who respect you adjust. Those who only benefited from your lack of boundaries drift away. And that natural selection isn't a loss, it's alignment. When you begin focusing on yourself, something very subtle rises to the surface. The realization that it's not just your emotions that are out of sync. Often there's a quiet insecurity running underneath everything, your relationship with money. Because it's hard to hold your boundaries, your choices, and a new version of yourself when deep down, you still carry fears of scarcity, anxiety about the future, and a sense of not being in control of your life. That instability weighs on you. It makes you hesitate, shrink yourself, accept less than you deserve, and delay important decisions, even when you know change is needed. And maybe you've felt that too. You learn to prioritize yourself emotionally, but financially you still feel stuck. You want to choose more freely, but money always seems to set the pace. That creates internal conflict, as if you're evolving on the inside but still dependent on something external to feel safe. And no one teaches you how to fix that. No one shows you that it's possible to have a light, conscious, and mature relationship with money, without guilt, without fear, and without overcomplicating things. That's why I created the Wealth Code, a guide designed for women who are learning to focus on themselves and are starting to realize that self-love also involves financial security. It helps you transform your relationship with money in a simple and accessible way, so you can build stability, confidence, and the peace of choosing your own path, without abandoning yourself, without shrinking, and without depending on others. If you feel like it's time to align your self-love with your financial life, the link is in the first pinned comment. Fourth topic. Focusing on yourself is relearning how to listen to yourself after years of noise. There's a very specific moment in the journey of someone who starts focusing on themselves. The silence gets loud. Without constant opinions, without external demands filling every space, you finally hear your own voice, and that can be scary. Because after so long living on autopilot, you realize you don't really know what you want, only what others expected of you. I felt that when, for the first time, I stopped packing my schedule with obligations. Empty spaces were left, and with them came questions I'd been avoiding for years. What do I actually enjoy? What drains me? What do I want to build from here on out? At first, these questions are uncomfortable because they don't have quick answers. But they're the questions that lead you back to yourself. Focusing on yourself isn't about becoming someone new overnight. It's about reconnecting with who you've always been before adapting too much. It's a process of relearning. You start noticing body signals, ignored intuitions, small desires that once felt irrelevant. And the more you listen, the more trust you build in yourself. This process is quiet because it happens from the inside out. No one sees when you choose to respect your exhaustion. No one claps when you decide not to go. No one notices when you change your mind to stay true to yourself. But it's those invisible choices that build a more honest life. When you listen to yourself, you start respecting yourself. And when you respect yourself, the way you show up in the world naturally changes. Comment: I trust my own voice. This affirmation strengthens the most important connection in your life, the one you have with yourself. Fifth topic. When you focus on yourself, your energy shifts before your life does. There's a transformation that happens before any visible change. Before new results, new relationships, or new opportunities, something almost imperceptible begins to shift: your energy. When you start focusing on yourself, the way you walk into a room, speak, choose, and respond begins to change. Not because you're trying to look different, but because you're finally aligned with yourself. I noticed this when I realized I no longer needed to prove anything. I used to over-explain, justify even simple decisions, and feel the urge to be understood all the time. But as I began focusing on me, that urgency faded. I spoke less, but with more confidence. I became more intentional about where I spent my time. I would leave early when something didn't feel right. And interestingly, the world began to respond differently to me. This shift in energy isn't arrogance, it's presence. People can feel when you're whole. They notice when you're no longer seeking validation, when your choices come not from lack, but from clarity. And that changes everything. Some people approach with more respect. Others drift away. Both are signs that something has been realigned. Focusing on yourself isn't about closing off from the world. It's about no longer scattering yourself too thin. It's about pulling your energy inward and directing it with intention. When you do that, life starts to respond, not because you asked, but because you changed your starting point. The truth is, the world reacts to how you treat yourself. When you prioritize yourself internally, it shows externally, even without words. Comment: my energy reflects who I choose to be. This affirmation anchors the invisible shift that precedes every other change. 6th topic. Focusing on yourself means learning to prioritize yourself without having to justify it. There's a defining moment in the self-love journey when you realize something liberating. You don't have to justify prioritizing yourself. In the beginning, every choice you make in your favor comes with long explanations, almost like apologies. You say no and immediately feel the urge to explain why, to soften the decision, to make sure no one is upset. This happens because for a long time, you learned that being good meant being available. I remember clearly when I started breaking that pattern. At first, the discomfort was intense. Saying I can't felt rude. Choosing rest felt lazy. Prioritizing my plans felt selfish. But slowly, I began to understand something essential. People who truly respect you also respect your limits, even if they don't understand your choices. Focusing on yourself is a daily exercise in trust. Trust that you don't have to explain everything. Trust that your boundaries don't need approval. Trust that your life doesn't have to fit other people's expectations. And that trust changes your posture. You begin to respond with more calm, decide with more clarity, and take a stand with less guilt. This process doesn't make you cold. It makes you honest. Honest with yourself and with others. You stop making promises you can't keep. You stop accepting what you don't want to sustain. You stop carrying responsibilities that aren't yours. And interestingly, this creates more authentic relationships because they're built on respect, not obligation. Focusing on yourself is no longer negotiating your peace. It's realizing that you don't have to be everything to everyone to be enough. Comment: my boundaries are an act of love. This affirmation seals the decision to prioritize yourself without guilt. 7th topic. Focusing on yourself changes your relationships, even when you're not trying to change anyone. When you start focusing on yourself, your relationships inevitably change. Not because you choose to walk away, but because the way you carry yourself is no longer the same. And this happens even when you don't say a word, even when you don't set rules, even when you don't give speeches. The change begins in you, and it echoes outward. I noticed this when I stopped insisting. I used to chase conversations, explanations, reconciliations. I wanted to be understood, validated, chosen. But when I began focusing on me, that urgency faded. I stopped begging for presence and started offering space. And it was in that space that some people revealed themselves. Some came closer with more care. Others simply didn't stay. At first, that hurts, because we tend to see distance as rejection. But over time, you understand. It wasn't rejection, it was realignment. Relationships that only existed because you shrank yourself can't survive when you expand. And that's not a loss, it's a consequence. Focusing on yourself doesn't mean loving others less. It means no longer putting yourself last just to maintain bonds that demand your silence, your constant adaptation, your exhaustion. When you treat yourself with more respect, you begin to require, without even saying a word, more mature connections. And something beautiful happens. The relationships that remain become lighter, more honest, more real, because they're no longer sustained by effort but by choice. Comment: I allow relationships that align with me. This affirmation makes space for connections that honor who you are becoming. 8th topic. Focusing on yourself means choosing consistency over intensity. Many women confuse self-love with isolated moments of self-care. A day off, a bold decision, a boundary set at the peak of exhaustion. But truly focusing on yourself isn't about intense occasional actions. It's about quiet consistency. It's about continuing to choose yourself when no one is watching, when there's no applause, no external validation. I realized this when I noticed a pattern in myself. I only prioritized me when I was at my limit. I would wait to get sick, explode, or burn out before I allowed myself to care. It was an emergency-based relationship with myself. That changed when I understood self-love isn't about rescue. It's about maintenance. It's not dramatic, it's daily. I started making small, repeated choices, going to bed on time even when I didn't feel like it, respecting my tiredness before collapsing, saying no without waiting to feel overwhelmed, maintaining boundaries even when everything seemed calm. These choices didn't draw attention, but they changed everything inside. Because every time I chose myself in silence, I reinforced the inner message that I matter. Intensity impresses, but consistency transforms. When you focus on yourself every day, even in small ways, you build emotional stability. And that stability reflects in how you face challenges, show up in relationships, and build your life. Focusing on yourself means stepping out of emotional highs and lows and stepping into steady presence. It's choosing yourself not only when it hurts, but especially when everything seems fine. Comment, I choose myself every day. This affirmation strengthens the quiet commitment that sustains a more whole life. 9th topic. Focusing on yourself means accepting that not everyone will come along for the ride. There's a quiet kind of pain that few talk about when you start focusing on yourself. The pain of realizing not everyone will walk with you to your next level. Some people get left behind, not out of malice, but because growth changes your pace, your conversations, your priorities. And not everyone is willing to go through that change. I felt this when I started recognizing myself in choices I never had the courage to make before. I began to want different things, to say yes less often, to value my time and energy more. Naturally, some connections started to fade. At first, I tried to bring everyone with me. I explained. I adapted. But then I learned something important. Growth is not up for negotiation. Focusing on yourself means accepting that you don't have to dim your light to fit into relationships that no longer grow with you. It means understanding that some people belong to past versions of your story. And that doesn't invalidate what was shared. It just means that chapter served its purpose. Growth hurts because it requires letting go. But staying small hurts every single day. When you accept that not everyone will keep up, something inside you is set free. You stop feeling guilty for changing. You stop carrying relationships out of duty. And you begin to open space for connections that honor who you're becoming. People who don't need you to shrink in order to be loved. Focusing on yourself is trusting that the right path, even if lonely at times, leads you to places you could never reach by staying somewhere you've outgrown. Comment, I honor my evolution. This affirmation strengthens the courage to move forward without dragging the past with you. 10th topic. Focusing on yourself is the most mature form of self-love. There's a kind of self-love that doesn't make noise, doesn't post quotes, and doesn't need to be announced. It reveals itself in quiet choices, tough decisions, and how you treat yourself when no one is watching. Focusing on yourself is that kind of love. Not romantic, but mature. Not impulsive, but steady. I realized this when I stopped waiting to feel something big in order to choose myself. I used to think self-love was a feeling. Now I know it's a stance. It's continuing to respect myself even on ordinary days. It's holding my boundaries even when giving in would be easier. It's not abandoning myself, even when no one would notice. Focusing on yourself doesn't mean putting yourself above others. It means standing beside yourself. It's ending the internal war of trying to be who others expect and starting to live in alignment with who you really are. It's when you stop being so hard on yourself and start taking better care. When you replace self-criticism with emotional responsibility. When you understand you don't need to lose yourself to be loved. This kind of love doesn't draw attention, but it changes everything. It changes how you choose, how you relate, how you build your life, because when you become your own safe place, the world becomes less threatening. Focusing on yourself is a silent commitment to never abandon yourself again, even if no one claps, even if no one notices, even if it takes time for the results to show. Comment, I am my own safe place. That phrase closes the cycle of self-abandonment and opens the door to a new way of living with yourself. Focusing on yourself isn't selfish, it's honest. Along the way, you learn to listen to yourself, to prioritize yourself, to hold boundaries, to embrace change, to release what no longer grows with you, and to gain a deeper relationship with who you are. It's a quiet process, but deeply transformative. When you focus on yourself, you don't become less available to the world. You become more whole. And whole people don't beg for space, don't negotiate their peace, and don't abandon themselves to belong. If this video resonated with you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment. I choose to focus on me. Because the most powerful self-love doesn't scream, it holds steady.